In this section, we will look at implementing virtual machines in vCloud Air. This is obviously the first thing that most people would like to do, and again, vCloud Air makes it really easy to do that. In vCloud Air, you can implement virtual machines from catalogs. The catalog can be a public catalog, which is available from vCloud Air, or you can have an organization catalog. So when you obtain an account in Air, you are given a organization, and in the organization you then set up virtual data centers. And again, as part of your organization, you can upload your own templates, your own media to be able to actually use in the Air environment. You can of course create VMs from scratch. We'll take a quick look at that as well. And we looked at this earlier, Bitnami templates, all the way from LAMP stacks to WordPress to content management systems, completely packaged, production quality, updatable with security updates, patches, and everything else like that, all available seamlessly in vCloud Air. So at this point in time, we will go into the Air environment and see how we can create our first virtual machine. And before we go into the lab itself, I am going to go to the whiteboard to sketch out what we will see in the beginning, and then what happens at the end in terms of the steps that one has to take from the beginning to the end to actually make a virtual machine accessible from the internet. So we are now at the whiteboard, and I'm going to get some ink and sketch out for you a few things here so that you are really able to understand what it is that we are going to be doing when we create a virtual machine. So what we are looking to do is to create a virtual machine, and we can, as we have seen, we can source it from a catalog. The catalog can be your organization catalog, where you can actually upload your own golden masters, your templates, your media, and so on, or you can take it from the Air catalog, which is basically the public catalog. Now the most, or rather one of the more powerful aspects of vCloud Air is that it is actually hooked up to Bitnami. So we've seen that before. If I can get my pen to work. Bitnami gives you predefined templates. Okay, so we want to create a virtual machine. Now what we also want to do is, and I'm going to change the color here because we are really looking to see what are the things that would probably need to be done. So in red, I'm going to mark down the list of things need to get done. So the first thing to do is to implement the virtual machine. The second thing to do is connect it to the internet so that we are then able to monitor it. Of course, you can use the console, but again, we are talking about vCloud Air, so we should be able to do things in the cloud from our internet device. So we should be able to connect to the interface, and again, internet. And so, really, what we have up here are two different aspects to this. Right? In the beginning, we'll create a virtual machine, and then, as a second step, we will connect it to the internet. Now, a few other things you should keep in mind. So one of the things that we have here is, and we've talked about it quite a bit, but I just want to draw it for you, and I want to draw it before we actually create a first virtual machine. In the beginning, right, we basically have vSphere. So somewhere in the cloud there is a vSphere environment that is running vCenter, okay, that has clusters and so on, right? It has storage, right? It has all these things. So this is running somewhere in the cloud, right? And that is part of what you see in the vCloud Air environment. In the middle is something we've talked about a lot, vCloud Director, and we are going to go into some depth into vCloud Director so that you have a really good understanding of vCloud Air. So this is your vCloud Air, but it's based on vSphere, and in the middle you have vCloud Director, and this is the part where you have organizations, you have virtual data centers, you have networks, you have gateways. Would be probably the more important items in vCloud Director. And right at the very end is actually where you have vCloud Air. This is the interface of vCloud Air, right? And here you see organizations, here you see virtual data centers, here you see networks, and here you see gateways, pretty much corresponding directly with what is provided by vCloud Director, except that the vCloud Air interface and the vCloud Director interface are very different things and have different capabilities. The vCloud Air interface basically does API calls to vCloud Director, and I'm pretty sure this is a REST API. Okay. Now, when you want to create a virtual machine in vCloud Air, you just go into the vCloud Air interface, as we will do shortly, and say implement a virtual machine. What that would do is it would talk to vCloud Director using the API, and in your organization, in the virtual data center that you've selected, it will create a virtual machine, okay, which in this case is actually called a vApp. We've seen that before. And it'll reside in the virtual data center network, and it'll have the gateways and everything else like that. But then what happens? What does vCloud Director do? It doesn't directly program any resources. What happens there is this: there is yet another API, not one call but many calls, and in fact, of course, you would have a distributed switch here. Now we are going to go into this in much more detail in the next section, but the idea here is to really understand that when you are asking for a new VM in vCloud Air, there's a whole bunch of activities, API calls, that are sent to the vCloud Director interface, and from there are sent to vSphere. Pretty sure this is a SOAP XML API, and there all the programming is done, so that there's a piece that is carved out of the cluster in terms of resources, there's a piece of storage that is carved out, the network is implemented on the distributed switch, and the virtual machine is actually set up. Now, to go into any more detail would not make much sense because we're talking about vCloud Air here, but realize that everything here resides on the vSphere environment in the end. These are simply layers. This is physical infrastructure. This is logical infrastructure. This is in fact the IaaS, infrastructure as a service, infra as a service. And of course your portal is your vCloud Air interface. This is your portal. Okay, so with this background, we are going to go to the actual Air interface and create a virtual machine. I have just logged in into vCloud Air, You've seen all this before. I will go into my service ID for this course, and while it goes through the process of authorizing me into the Virginia Air site, it's loading up the list of VDCs here for me, and we look at the INE VDC, and we see that I have two virtual machines already implemented up here. Now when I click on this virtual machine, it gives me the information around that. When I click on the networks for that virtual machine, it actually gives me the virtual machine address, which is 192.168.109.2, and the gateway, which is 144.243.185. So going back to the VDC, okay, I say that I need to create a new virtual machine. So I click on new virtual machine. It's now loading all the templates, and as you can see, there are CentOS templates for 32-bit and 64-bit. There are Ubuntu servers, there's a Photon server, and lo and behold, there are also Windows templates available. And so this is a very powerful one, 2012 Data Center R2 with SQL 2014. As you can see, there's a licensing fee associated with the use of this template, and there's some pricing and stuff like that that's associated with it as well, which is obviously a lot more than the templates we're going to use for our purposes, which are basically CentOS 6.4 or 6.3 templates. So just to get things going, we're looking at the VMware catalog. So this is the catalog that is provided by Air. Let's look at my catalog. Now in my catalog, since I've already implemented one of those machines, I have a template that is available, which is a CentOS 63 template, because I've already implemented a CentOS machine. Okay, so let's just go back to the VMware catalog, and this time let's implement the same 32-bit CentOS 6.3 machine, and we click on that. We've selected that, and we continue. And what it's doing now is loading the configuration, and it's giving me a cost here as well. So you can see the base configuration at this point in time is 1 CPU. I can go up to 16 apparently on this. 2 gig of memory is the minimum. You can go up to 100 gig. Storage from 20 gig minimum to 2 gig. The storage policy is accelerated. You know what? Let's just, for the heck of it, change it to standard. So let's just make things a little less expensive for doing this. For the network, it's going to load the various networks, and I'm going to select the INE network for this, because that also exists. That's something that I created earlier. I'm not going to power on the machine after creation. Now you can see from the cost, I pay 4 cents an hour for the memory, and I pay a cent an hour for the CPU while this machine is up and running. So I can add a description, or I can change the name. So let's change the name, INE demo 1. We add a description. This is the INE demo machine for the. Okay, so we now have a description for it, and I click on creating the virtual machine, and really that is all there is to it in terms of creating the virtual machine. It's going to go through its activities. You can see here it is. It's creating INE demo -1. So when that virtual machine has been created, it's going to be basically powered off, and we will power it on at some point in time. So while all that is happening, let's just take a look at a machine that I already have set up. It's a CentOS 63 32-bit machine, exactly like the one I've set up here, but I have done a few things to it to make it accessible. So when I look at the networks for it, I see that while it loads the network list, that it has a virtual machine IP address of 192.168.109.2, and it has a public gateway address of 144.243.185. Okay, I am now going to start up a putty, and I will key in the gateway address 144.2.43.185. and I'm doing a secure shell login through obviously port 22 to this. And what will happen is that it'll take me in, and it would, I'm gonna move the screen up here. Here we go. It shows me the screen. I log in as root and I change the password there. And that is the virtual machine I had actually set up there. As you can see, the host name that I had created there, it's different from the description that I have set up on Air, just to make the point that they are actually different. One is metadata and one is data stored within the CentOS environment. Okay. Now, how did I get from 144.2.43.185, which is a public address, to this private address? Well, the putty program obviously went to 144.2.43.185, which was the gateway. And now what happened? Okay, what happened here is that the gateway, one of the NICs on the gateway, the virtual NICs on the gateway, is connected to the 192.168 network, and this virtual machine is connected to that network with an address of .2, 192.168.109.2, and that is how it actually connected. Now, of course, you will say, well, you actually went to 144.243.185. How did it get to this 192 address? And obviously, there was NAT, or network address translation, involved in here. So now it's time to just take a look at the network address translation that I have already set up. And actually, there's a little bit more to that. Apart from the NAT, I also have to set up the firewall, because I went in on port 22 for secure shell, and obviously the firewall needs to let in traffic through port 22. So let's switch gears at this point in time, having understood that the existing virtual machine was set up in the same way as this new virtual machine is being set up. And in the interest of time, we will just look at the virtual machine I have already set up, but we will look at the firewall specifications and the firewall rules, and we will look at the network address translation for this virtual machine, so that it can be translated from the public address 144 to the 192.168.109.2 private address. So we are now back in the Air interface. We are back to INE VDC2, which is where we've set up our activities. Remember, the gateway IP was 144.243.185. That's the one we actually used to get to the virtual machine. Now it's time to look at the gateway, because we need to look at NAT and we need to look at firewall rules. So I click on Manage in vCloud Director link, and it should show up here, because it opens up in a new tab. That's a good thing. So we are now here in vCloud Director for that same VDC, INE VDC2, and we are in the vCloud Director interface. So I select the one gateway that we have, and I look at Edge Gateway Services, because these are services provided by the virtual gateway that I have. Now, again, we're going to go through each one of these in great detail later on, but at this point we are simply interested in looking at the firewall rule to make sure that it is passing port 22. And as you can see, I have enabled the firewall. Okay, my default action is deny. This is all very conventional firewall configuration, but the rule I have put in there is something you would not put in production, which basically says take any source, any port, and set it to any destination, any port, any protocol, and allow it, and I've enabled that. Okay, now that just simplifies things for me at this point in time, because we are teaching a course, but that's not obviously something you would do in real life. We will go into much more detail in terms of setting up firewall rules in the firewall section, but just as a teaser, when you click on add, you can add a firewall rule. You can give it a name, pass port 22. Okay, your valid values for the source can be IP address, any internal or external. This is very interesting, internal or external. You can put an IP range, okay, but let's just say from any outside source, okay. It would go, so let's say, only to the SSH port, and it can again be any internal or external, and I could just say any internal to the cloud here, right? So any internal to my data center. Any destination port, no, I want to actually change it. I want to change it to secure shell, and you have the TCP protocol, and I want to allow it. And optionally you could log network traffic, although probably depends on security policies. Some organizations actually do require logging onto network traffic, and anytime you go into a secure shell. Anyway, let's just click this, okay, and here it is. Okay, we have a new rule from any source on for port 22, internal destination on port 22, which means I set up any other virtual machine I can get to it. TCP allow, log it, and enable it, right? And when I click on OK, what I'm going to do is to actually just click on this, edit it, and I'm going to say disable, simply in the interest of getting this course moving smoothly. So I will disable that. However, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to click on OK, and what it does is it's configuring the edge. As you can see at this point in time, it's configuring the edge gateway. Remember, it's a software product. It's configuring the edge gateway with the new firewall rule which we just set up. Now, interestingly enough, think about where we are at this point in time. We are in the internet, right? And we are in a cloud in the internet. That's a virtual concept. In there, we are in a virtual organization, in a virtual data center, running in that cloud, and we are running virtual machines there. The gateways and all the other things that we have in there are all virtual. So configuration here of this edge gateway, as you can see, it's complete at this point in time, is all virtual. We still need to look at the NAT for this. So let's look at NAT, and again we'll just look at it briefly because we have a full section on network address translation. I click on NAT. As you can see, I have some firewall, some NAT rules already defined, and the ones that are important are basically these two. The virtual machine I just showed you, this one, okay. I can do an IF config on this, and you can see its address is 192.168.109.2, right? And this is your source NAT, which comes first actually. So if our original IP address is 192.168.109.2 on any port, I would translate that to 144.243.185, which is the address of our public, which is the public IP address of our gateway, right? And of course you can see the NAT rule I put in: any translated port, any protocol. I could obviously change this to port 22. I could also, if I had additional things, I could put in port 22, 22, and so on. I think all of you understand the drill. And then you have the destination NAT, right? So if I have a packet coming in from the outside to a destination of 144.243.185, which is my public IP address, which is what's coming through from this PuTTY session, then I need to translate that to my private address, which is 192.168.109.2. So again, this is very straightforward. There's no command line here. It's all done graphically. We'll go into much more detail in the separate section on NAT, but realize that the source NAT, the destination NAT, which are these two in this case, are the ones that are being used, and the firewall rule in this case, the any rule actually, because it is above the pass port 22 rule. I could move this down here, for example, and then this rule would take precedence. But the point of it is that the gateway, and we have a separate section of course on the edge gateway, is extremely powerful. As you can see from here, there's a load balancer functionality, a VPN functionality which we will use extensively, static routing which we don't really need, but I will talk about that, a DHCP which we will not use, but I will talk about that. Again, all very conventional network services that are implemented as virtual network functions, or actually network virtual functions, NFV, network functions virtualization, and NFV, in the edge gateway provided to us. So I'm going to cancel out of that, and we are going to go back to the tab which is the vCloud Air tab, and we look at our virtual machines, and as you can see, our INE demo machine is now available, but it is powered off. So I will select that, right, and it is, you can see, it is actually powered off. What we need to do now is to obviously power it on, and I want to go back to my virtual machine menu. I click on that, I've selected that, and I click on power on, and this machine would then be in the process, as you can see, of powering on. It is busy at this point in time. Now just very quickly, what we can do is to take a look at our cloud here, right? Look at our VDC, and in terms, look at the actions, and we manage it in vCloud director, and the virtual machine INE demo 1 is ready. We saw that up there, and then I switch to the tab, and here I am back in vCloud director. I look at my virtual apps, right, and as you can see, INE demo 1 vApp, okay, is currently starting up. So it's in operation. It takes a while for things to actually get going. So back to the VMware Cloud Air. You can see that it shows powered on here, but in vCloud director it's not. It's basically going through its configuration process. It's the first time it's started up, so it needs to find out what network it's going to connect it to. It's going to find out all other aspects of it, and kind of the first time around just takes a little bit longer than otherwise. So what we have covered here basically is setting up a new virtual machine in vCloud director, and using this machine that I had already set up, we looked at the NAT, network address translation, that we have to do from the public address to the private address, and that we need to look at the firewall and open up the ports. And we took a brief look at how to add firewall rules, and we took a brief look at the source NAT and the destination NAT as well. Both capabilities or services will be covered in great depth in their own sections as we go along. Again, just as a reminder, instead of using the CentOS template from the public library that's available in vCloud Air, I could have implemented any one of these pre-configured templates, and these are all production quality templates from Bitnami. And after signing in, because I have linked my Bitnami ID to my VMware account, I can select from Bitnami, and it loads up on VMware vCloud Air. So we have seen how we can create virtual machines from catalogs that exist in VMware or vCloud Air in our own catalog, which will get populated anytime you select a machine from VMware catalog. You can also directly add to your catalog, and in fact the catalog is directly managed through the vCloud director interface, and we can take a look at that because that's one of the advanced features that we have available there. The one thing we have not covered in the section, which we said we would cover catalogs, implementing new virtual machines from catalogs from Bitnami. We've done both. What we have not done is taken a quick look at create my virtual machine from scratch, which is what we're going to do now. So when I click on create my virtual machine from scratch, let's see where that takes us. As you can see, it took us to the vCloud director interface into vApps, because remember, the underlying technology behind all this is vCloud director virtual apps or vApps. Now here we see the plus sign lets us add a virtual app from the catalog. This icon allows us to add a virtual app from an OVF. So we can attach an OVF to it, we can attach a CD, or there are different ways of doing this. I could build a completely new vApp. A vApp is basically a container that can contain multiple virtual machines, right? And I can, of course, manage, power on, power off, and reset, pause rather, the vApps. So again, when you're doing this, it view the uploads and downloads, because you can upload and download into Air. So let's take a quick look at that. Let's build. Let's click on the plus sign. It says select a vApp template. So when I look at my organization's catalogs, Gold Masters, there's nothing in there. We look at all templates in my organization, and of course that one template of CentOS 6.3 32-bit shows up just like it did on the Air interface. But if from the drop down I select the public catalog, I have in a different interface all those options available that we saw earlier in the Air interface. So just for the heck of it, let's just select one of these, okay, and kind of move on. And as you can see, it's actually pretty interesting, because now you understand, now you see a little bit more behind the scenes. Behind the scenes, you see the storage policy in vCloud Director is something called NFS catalog storage policy. So this is using NFS rather than the quote-unquote standard that you were seeing there before. Anyway, so let's look at next. And when you do that, it's going to ask you for a name. A vApp is a cloud computer system that uses one or more virtual machines. So we're going to call it INE. Sometimes the interface acts interestingly. Just took a couple of seconds here, but again it populated a name in there. I obviously want to change this name. I will call it INE vApp. I can select the virtual data center in which this would run. In my organization in Virginia, I have 2 VDCs. We'll just let this stay. So this is good. We'll keep INE VDC2. Interesting thing, again, these are all vCloud Director terminology, right? Leases. So this vApp will not be powered down. It will be powered on indefinitely. It will not be deleted also if you power it off or suspend it. But this can be changed at any time by going into the properties of the virtual app. Again, this is like underlying stuff that is part of vCloud Director, but obviously available for vCloud Air. Enough said. We go into next. We configure the resources, and as soon as this ungrays itself, I will change the storage policy to standard. I click next. The NIC is not connected to a network. Now I want to do is to connect it to the INE network. Static IP pool. So what happens is that it picks up the first unused address from the IP pool that's been defined for the INE network. And again, we'll go into more details when we talk about the vCloud Director networks. An interesting checkbox here is switch to advanced networking workflow. Well, let's click on that. More detail to come later on when we talk about vCloud Director, but we are here. And this is where you could actually change it. So you could give it a static manual address, and you can key in your address there. You can get a DHCP address from your gateway, but we'll just put it back to static IP pool. Again, these options are only available when you check this box. Okay, so I uncheck the box. So what will happen is my new vApp, okay, another one will be created. Its first NIC is going to be attached to the INE network, and it will pick up the first IP address that is available in that IP pool. And when I click next, I have the option of looking at how many CPUs I need, the cores per socket. It allows me only 1 core per socket, but gives me the ability to have up to 64 virtual CPUs. I really don't want to do that because I'm sure there's some upcharge for it. We leave it basically as it is, but realize you can customize the hardware for the virtual machine. And here we are. we are going to create a vApp, vApp. It'll have a virtual machine in init1 at this point in time. The guest OS is will be this CentOS 6332-bit, and storage policy standard and so on, stuff we saw before. Runtime lease never expires. Okay, storage lease never expires. If you shut it off, then this virtual machine storage will be kept. And as we saw before, it's going to be connected. Its NIC is going to be connected to the INE network. Not going to power on the app after this wizard is finalized, because that takes a while it powers up. Remember, for the very first time, so it's got to find out its environment and then kind of understand all that and plug everything in, so that's it's just a lot faster the second time around. So I click finish, and this vApp, which we see here, we go, INE vApp, it's busy creating it, right? So this is the vCloud director view. There is a home where you see your vApps. There is a my cloud where you see your vApps in a different way with all the virtual machines and everything else in there. These are the catalogs, my organization catalogs, which has a default catalog, and then the public catalog, which is basically available as well, where we picked up other thing. You can also have in the catalog vApp templates, and which obviously we saw here, right? The same list we saw here. These are all vApp templates in the public catalog, which is why we can see them. And there is no other media that's available at this point. We can put our own media in there as well. And then there is this administration tab. Again, things we're going to go into much more detail. You can set up settings for your virtual data center, right? I changed the name to a more meaningful name. Although the organization name is this in vCloud Director and in vCloud Air. In some other implementations of the cloud, that's the VMware vCloud Director based cloud, the organization name is actually done quite nicely. You don't have this long hexadecimal string to worry about. Things you can set up would be email and different policies. This is that storage lease things we talked about, right? We just created a vApp that will always keep running. But you could say that you could set up a lease that this application actually, or this vApp would actually run only for an hour. And then I could say my storage I only need for an hour. Obviously very useful when you're testing and development, because you don't want to pay for this when you stop testing. So run it for a while, and then just in case you become busy with something else, you want to make sure the system stops it. And so that's what I'm going to do. Not going to worry about explaining permanent delete and expiration. That's part of vCloud Director. Maximum storage lease, again, I'm just going to keep everything at 1 hour. Now the interesting part is, if I do this, it's going to be applicable for all my vApps. And because I don't want to do that, I'm going to simply click on revert, and everything goes back to the way it was set up for me by VMware in the Air environment that is based on vCloud Director, which is the interface that you see at this point in time. So we are back to our slide. We have seen how one could implement very easily a virtual machine in vCloud Air, either from the public catalog, which is what we did. We picked up the CentOS machine. You could also pick it up from one of the Bitnami templates. We saw how we could do that as well. We looked at the LAMP stack. We also saw in great depth how you can create the VM from scratch, which basically in this case moves us over to the vCloud Director interface, where you create a vApp with one virtual machine in it. But when we select the guest OS or the template from the public catalog, it gives us the same list that we saw in a different interface in vCloud Air, and we went through that from start to finish as well. So that completes our section on implementing virtual machines in Air. I like the title of this slide quite a bit, because really what we're doing is we are implementing a virtual machine, which is not a real thing in a sense, in a cloud, which is not a real thing in the sense, and everything is virtual. So there are multiple levels of virtualization that are present at this point in time, including the most important thing we saw in there, which was our edge gateway, where we saw two services. We saw how to configure the network address translation service, so that one could translate the public address to the private address of the application. And then we also saw the firewall and the firewall rule that had to be implemented in there as well to be able to get secure shell access. So it's all virtual here, right? Even those firewalls and load balancers and network devices are all virtual. So it's really a far cry from the physical infrastructure that one has to wait for to provision clicking buttons, basically, as we did here. Okay, there was not one command line in this. Clicking buttons and just knowing our way around vCloud Air, and a little bit also around vCloud Director, which is going to be our next step when we start looking at the vCloud Air networking, is really all you need to know. You don't need to worry about vCenters and clusters and storage and resource pools and distributed switches and port groups and virtual NICs and VM NICs, all the vSphere stuff. As an end user, you just think in terms of, I need a CentOS system setup, and you go and you just click on it. You can click on that button that says connect to internet and you're done. I showed you the behind the scenes way to do it, because as network professionals that we should really know what clicking a button actually does. So clicking a button to give you internet access opens up basically the firewall and does a network address translation rule for you. I trust clicking the button and knowing what I'm doing step by step, rather than wondering what happened if a button doesn't work.